Right, so hi, I'm Sarah. Thank you very much for coming today. And I'm going to be talking about not just blockchains, but sort of more generally the theme of transparency. And in trying to enable transparency in a lot of different settings, including actually some sort of governance structures. And the blockchain will sort of be this underpinning of how we can actually start to provide this transparency. Just a tiny bit of background about myself. I'm a lecturer at UCL in computer science. I work a lot on computer security, privacy, transparency, and so I'm very much on the sort of technical foundation side of this, actually trying to build the technologies that ultimately I'm hoping we can adopt to achieve these goals. All right, so in terms of the goals, I just want us to briefly think about a lot of the interactions that we engage in every day. And I don't even mean the interactions we have with technology. I mean really basic stuff like how you got here today, who you're going to meet up with later, maybe you're sending like text messages right now, stuff we're really doing all the time. So I think with all of these interactions, we always have this level of sort of explicit goals and explicit expectations. So when you got in your car to get here or got on the bus, you were saying, wow, I hope I get there on time, so I hope the bus isn't delayed. If you're sending a text, the person you're texting, you hope they receive it, and maybe you even hope they respond, right? So there are just these sort of very direct outcomes that we really want from the actions that we take. So I want to focus more, actually, on what I think are this sort of subconscious layer of expectations that we also bring into these same interactions. Okay, so we're not necessarily, thinking about these, but I just want to highlight a few that are relevant to our feelings of privacy and security. So the first one I want to mention, kind of continuing with the example of sending a text, is this idea of confidentiality. Okay, so when we send a text message, when we enter our bank details into websites, when we store sensitive documents in Dropbox, we're probably hoping that, everyone in the world isn't reading that interaction, isn't looking at the files in our Dropbox. Okay, and if our employer or our service provider or our government is reading them, maybe that's something we don't really want to be happening. Somewhat less frequently than sending texts, but still something all of us do. We tend to buy things, okay? So whether that's buying lunch or buying clothes or diamonds or whatever, we hope that these products that we're buying satisfy some notion of integrity. Now this, of course, varies hugely person to person, but you could imagine, say, wanting to shop local, wanting to buy sustainable or organic clothing, and looking at labels and things like this, looking for these logos to see if that's happening. And then finally, sort of the very buzzy idea of the sharing economy and all of us using all these different apps gives rise to this final goal, which I'm calling the data democracy, right? So the idea is that increasingly, as individuals, we're just generating huge volumes of data about ourselves. Okay, and at the individual level, I would be happier for you to learn, say, the last Airbnb I stayed at than my bank details. But as it grows, and in aggregate, this data is telling you a lot about who I am and about what I like to do. And so this idea of democracy is maybe I'd like a say in how that data is getting used, and which marketers and advertisers are getting to see that data. Or even if I don't get a say, maybe I'd just like to know what's happening behind the scenes with my data. So again, I think these are all very subconscious. I realize I'm a privacy researcher. I'm a lot more conscious about these things than probably most. But I do think that, over the last few years, we've seen that these goals do matter to people, even people who say, oh, privacy is dead. So when things happen, like we find out that our governments are spying on us, or we find out that, companies have child slavery in their supply chains, we do really react to this information, okay? So we get upset, campaigns get launched, people get fired, and, slowly but surely, we do start to see shifts. So the question I want to pose then is, to the extent that these expectations do matter, and I think ultimately they do matter to some extent to all of us, what makes us think that they're being met? What makes us think that any of these things are happening at any level? So probably a lot of us tend to just say, well, I don't really know, or you might use like your trust in a company as a proxy, right? You might say, well, that's a pretty big company, surely it would be a scandal if they were like sharing all my data, behind the scenes, or, oh, I saw this really nice padlock when I went to their privacy policy, or I went to their menu and they said where all their meat comes from, or they kind of identified their farms. And, I'm certainly not bashing these efforts. These are amazing efforts. But ultimately, these companies just all have so much going on behind the scenes that it seems really impossible to verify these kinds of claims, okay? There are just so many moving parts going into every single product and every single interaction out there, right? So companies producing physical goods just can't go look at every corner of their supply chain. And companies sharing data can't go follow up with every single person who they share data with to in turn see what they're doing with your data. Okay, and in case you sort of say, well, that's not true, maybe small companies could do this, I just wanted to quickly sort of run through, a very simple setting and try to highlight some of the very complex relationships underlying it. So I've picked a setting sort of very, near to my own heart, which is this idea of keeping online communications private. So hopefully a lot of us in this room have been trained to look for this nice green padlock in the browser bar when we say are entering passwords or bank details into websites. If you haven't been trained, please start doing that. It's very important. And the question is, what's going on with that green padlock? How did it get there, and what's it actually promising? So the first question is, how did it get there? So the idea is that you're sending sort of information to someone, let's say to Google, if you're logging into like a Gmail account, and you want this data to only be readable by Google themselves. So on the left here, I'm showing you the first set of entities who are essentially promising you that this is happening. Okay, so these are entities called certificate authorities, and they're essentially saying like, yeah, this is Google, okay? I have some information associated with them, and so I can confirm that when you're sending your information off in the world, Google's gonna read it at the end and not someone else. All right, so you're very much trusting these certificate authorities to accurately know that this is Google and tell you that information. So this is great, you've seen the green padlock, you've entered your data. What happens next? Okay, so this is something we think about even less than those subconscious expectations, but the internet is actually a physical object, right? So the data has to actually travel somewhere after you've entered it into the website. And so in the middle here, I've admittedly somewhat arbitrarily put the operators of some of the main submarine cables in the world. So these are literally the physical cables that your data has to travel along as it goes from your laptop here to Google servers. Okay, and again, you're very much trusting the operators of these cables. For example, that people aren't tapping the cables and watching all the traffic along them, and in general to sort of maintain the quality of this data transmission. So of course, you're not trusting them solely. As your data travels along these cables, it's not in the clear. Your password isn't just sitting there. It's encrypted, okay? So it's protected using cryptographic means. But how many of us understand how this cryptography works? I mean, I have literally a PhD in cryptography, and I don't understand all the algorithms myself, okay? So here, finally, we have the people who are saying to you, I understand how this cryptography is working, and I am telling you that this is really good cryptography and that your data is not going to be compromised if you use these algorithms. Okay, so these are like standardization bodies who are making these promises to the general public. So I'm guessing that of the names on this slide, most of us will have heard of exactly one name, and that's the NSA. And I'm not going to say anything about the NSA, positive or negative, but the point is that this leaves 11 other names on the slide that you've absolutely never heard of, and that you are nevertheless really crucially trusting with the integrity and confidentiality of your data as it travels across the internet. All right. So the point of this wasn't, oh, you need to start looking up these companies, you need to start doing this. The point was that this is one peek behind one sort of very small curtain. And I think increasingly, in the past few years, the other peeks we've had behind various other curtains has illustrated that there's a lot of room to improve, okay? And that maybe the model we've taken over the past decades of relying on these sort of opaque centralized mechanisms is not the best idea. Okay, and it seems like a really good time to start rethinking this approach, to think about sort of shining a light into what's going on and actually holding these companies accountable for their actions. Okay, and I do sort of put this quote up because I do think that ultimately this is probably the only way we have going forward to keep really big open environments like the internet actually democratic. So I'm hoping that this has served as motivation. And now I'm actually going to get into the how of this, which is how can we actually start supporting this transparency. So as I said at the top, this is going to be using this very buzzy idea of a blockchain. Now, of course, we've heard what a blockchain is, but you might still be left wondering, what is a blockchain? So those of you, by the way, who haven't heard of blockchains, it's essentially the architecture underpinning the Bitcoin cryptocurrency. Those of you who haven't heard of Bitcoin, it doesn't even matter. I'm going to kind of go through everything. But those of you who have heard of blockchain either may have heard some very obscure explanations, or you may have heard of it as this like superhero solution to every single problem out there. Okay, this is essentially how it's being sold at the moment. So I wanted to sort of step back from this question of what it is and ask why. Why are we even talking about using blockchains at all? What really concretely is this technology trying to solve? So I wanted to illustrate this with just a bit of an example. This is an example I'm much less familiar with, but nevertheless, my simplistic understanding of the setting is as follows. So this is the setting of music and music rights. So on the left here, we have some nice musicians. They create music for us, and they hold some kind of rights over the music they're producing. And then on the right, we have these sort of different ways music can be used. Okay, music can be streamed, downloaded, purchased, used in films, turned into sheet music. And for each of these individual use cases, there's some sort of money that's then owed to the musicians. Right, so we have these musicians, they know which songs they have the rights for, and then we have the services, and they know which songs they're using, and thus how much they owe whoever happens to own that song. So now we have this sort of matchmaking problem. How do the services, who might honestly want to pay the musicians, how do they find them? And so what we've seen crop up in this space is this kind of ecosystem of gateways, okay, or interfaces between the musicians and the services. So these are databases like Grace Notes or societies like BMI that essentially act to collect money from the services on behalf of the musicians. Okay, so they're sort of there to simplify these interactions. So for example, if, say, Spotify is collecting streaming data on a song, at some point they want to go pay whoever created that song. So what they do is they look up in the database, who owns the song, and then they can go and pay them directly. So here, we're not only trusting Spotify to accurately record streaming data, which is a whole separate issue, we're also trusting Grace Notes to accurately report to Spotify who the owner is, okay, so that they can then pay the right person. And similarly, in other settings, we're sort of seeing that having these gateways builds up this additional layer of trust, right? So if the filmmaker, to simplify things, pays BMI, we're now trusting BMI that they're then going to actually compensate the musicians for their work. So I've picked this setting, largely because I think, music is quite universal. We all hopefully listen to music and enjoy it. And, there also has been a bit of press, if you're reading up on it, that this ecosystem isn't necessarily operating as well as it could be. The truth is, though, I could have picked really any setting. So going back to the certificate authorities, what we want is kind of this clean communication between us and the operators of the websites we use. Instead, we're sort of stuck with these certificate authorities sitting in the middle, another trust layer. We want to sort of buy things from people who are creating things, but again, sort of a matching problem. This is how we end up, going through big retailers, and again, another trust assumption. We're hoping the retailers pay the producers. And then, finally, in this data democracy setting, we're not only trusting the app developers to use our data and give it to marketers in a responsible way, but actually the marketers are also trusting the developers to give them accurate data, okay, and to give them the data they're actually looking for. So if I just want to abstract away the specifics of each of these settings, what we have are people producing data and people looking to consume that data. And just because of this sort of technological communication gap, we end up with this whole economy of gateways sitting in the middle. Okay, and each of these gateways is operating their own interface and has their own way that they're willing to interact with people. Okay, and people sort of have to just pick the gateway that they're going to use. So I think this is sort of the reason why, when we talk about the big data age and whatever, we're talking about a tsunami of data. Okay, or we're talking about like a fire hose. I mean, all the analogies I've heard in this space just give this impression that we're just completely overwhelmed. Okay, and I don't think volume is the issue. The volume has definitely gone up, but we know that computers can scale really, really well and can handle large volumes well. Instead, I think the issue is this sort of complexity and diversity of interfaces. Okay, so we as humans, we tend to like uniformity. We like when we can interact with everything in the same neat way. And if any of you in the audience have dealt with different database formats or APIs or stuff like that, scraped websites, I hope you know what I'm talking about. It can get very frustrating very quickly when people just sort of do things in subtly different ways for seemingly no reason. Okay, so what we've ended up with then is this setting. We have these companies in the middle who are operating in just completely opaque silos, and we have seemingly no way to avoid this. Okay? But finally, 15 minutes into my talk, I've gotten to the point, which is actually this is what blockchains are designed to do. Okay, so the picture, when we start using something like a blockchain, I also tend to prefer the term distributed ledger, since blockchain is not very informative. We essentially have this distributed open framework sitting in the middle now. Okay, we got rid of the silos, and data is now sitting in this sort of transparent record in the middle here. Okay, so already we're seeing this really nice openness, and this already brings in this feature of accountability that we want. Okay, anyone with access to this ledger can go start auditing the behavior of these individual companies and seeing if they're doing what they should be. But I actually want to take it one step further. Okay, so let's go back to the music setting, and let's consider this streaming example on Spotify. So imagine now that a user streams a song on Spotify. What we can do is we can record in this ledger that action of streaming that song. We can also record in the ledger the owner of each song. So we can have this sort of map from owners to songs, and now we have the action of playing the song. And so what we can do is we can trigger an automatic payout using that information to the owner of the song. Okay, so no one has to intervene. Grace Notes doesn't have to tell anyone what's there. They can just sort of load it all into the ledger. Spotify doesn't have to sit there and collect it. It's all just in the ledger, and it just goes to the musician without anyone's intervention. And the same thing can be true in this sort of filmmaking example. The filmmaker can just say, hey, I used this song, record that in the ledger, and the musicians can get paid, again, completely automatically. So what we're seeing is the system we have now is very much setting up these artificial barriers between producers and consumers of data. These companies are acting as these sort of intermediate silos, and using the blockchain, we really have this potential to get rid of not only the barriers, but sort of also the trust that we're placing in these companies. So just to kind of summarize what I think is going on here, we're really, again, and I want to mention, by the way, this is all very much potential. These technologies are really in their nascency. But we have the potential to move from these siloed proprietary data structures to things that are completely distributed and thus provide a nice unified interface. And then, on a trust standpoint, rather than just sort of blindly depending on trusting these silos, because we really have no choice, we have no visibility into them, we actually have a completely transparent system. And so we can actually check for ourselves whether what's going on is okay with us. So this is all well and good, but I just want to sort of end the talk with, well, what's next? I mean, what are we doing with all of this? Okay, so as I said, these technologies are not ready today. I would not, buy a blockchain today if I were you. But where can we take this? So as I mentioned, I'm very much an academic, and there is a lot of academic effort at the moment, and non-academic, development effort at the moment, to push these things and make them better. All right, so we're sort of working on the back end, working on the product. But if you know academics, you'll know that this is our language that we speak. Okay, we're not necessarily the best at communicating our ideas, and actually, I think even worse, we don't even necessarily know what people want from technology. Okay, so we might not even be targeting the right problems. And this, finally, is where I'm really sort of hoping to get other people involved in this movement. It can't just be sort of academics and diehard Bitcoin believers getting into this. Okay, so if you sort of work, say, at a brand, and you're trying to make really good guarantees about traceability, I'd really encourage you to just know that this is out there and know that there's this potential to actually start reinforcing these promises in a very, very strong way. Similarly, if you work in sort of advertising, marketing, start promoting this. I think going forward, we're going to see that transparency can really provide sort of a unique selling point for the companies that adopt it first, okay? Because it really is such a stronger guarantee than anything we've seen so far. And then, finally, if you're sort of just interested, if you work in design or anything like that, the existing interfaces we have into these technologies, they could use some work, and that's honestly being quite generous. So sort of getting regular people to interact and engage with these things in a way that's useful for them is, I think, a kind of huge, huge open problem. Okay, so well, that's really it from me on a sort of professional level. I do hope I've at least planted a bit of a seed in terms of getting you thinking about ways to apply these technologies and what they're sort of providing. And then almost more importantly to me, on a personal level, I hope I've gotten you to maybe reconsider some of these interactions you do have on an everyday basis, and to think about how much these subconscious expectations do matter to you, and maybe even bring them to a bit more of a conscious level. So thank you very much.